hear me?
Yes.
Okay? Yeah. Okay. So when I started to work on the Shetland Islands, my angle of approach wasn't territorial or physical at all. It was purely based on archive materials. I had found great sources and worked on them without any consideration for the surrounding world of the Shetlanders. But after a few months of studies, I realized that I had to take a step back and look at what was around me, and look at what the Shetlanders could have seen in the 18th century. But it was me who was looking, and not an 18th century Shetlander. What I saw was peaty hills, the sea everywhere, and with my very meager sailing skills and my 21st century habits of everything going fast, I thought that it must have been extremely difficult to live on these islands, to be isolated from the rest of the world. But there was a problem. The more I went back to the archive materials, the less I would see the 18th century Shetland communities as isolated or entirely turned towards the sea. No, these communities were, from the written sources, complex, and their relationship with the sea and the archipelagic space was not so obvious. Therefore, I asked myself, how islands, and especially the Shetland Islands, have been studied by human and social sciences scholars. How can we put back social and historical perspectives in island studies? And eventually, how did Shetlanders live in the 18th century, and did it matter that Shetland is an archipelago? And I'd like to insist here on the fact that this paper is really an essay. It contains mostly work hypotheses. This is not a firm and definitive answer to the few questions that I just asked. Okay, so for those who might not know the Shetland Islands geography well enough, I think here are a few facts that one should remember. The Shetland Island lies some 150 kilometers to the northeast of the Scottish mainland and some 360 kilometers to the west of Norway. In the 18th century, Lith, which was Edinburgh's harbour port, was located at 477 kilometers south of Lerwick, which meant that the archipelago was geographically closer to the town of Bergen than to Edinburgh. At the beginning of the 18th century, about 30 islands out of 100 were inhabited, which meant that Shetland's density was about, I think, 10 inhabitants per square kilometer. Only 4% of the land was under cultivation by the beginning of the 19th century, and Shetland's territory is being mostly covered with unprotrophic bog, basically acid peatland and vast loch. So I would like to start with the way the history of Ireland is written nowadays. So I think we need to start with a common language, because historians, geographers, social scientists, but also French-speaking or English-speaking scholars have different words to express different ideas about islands. In my opinion, these three specific words need a definition because they are understood with great variation in different academic works. So I will use here a definition given by Anne Lesterheim in 1997 in her work Figure de l'unité, image de la complexité. So in this paper, she elaborates on the notion of islandness, but what she also does is that she gives a proper definition to three different words: insularity, insularism, and islandness. She explained that most of the time the word insularity covers also the meaning and reality of the two other words. She defines insularity as a set of measurable realities accessible from figures or quantified data. The word insularity defines geographical and economical realities. Insularism reflects both sociopolitical and geographical phenomena and distinguishes the peculiar institutions of the island. Therefore, insularism defines political and institutional realities. The word islandness is defined as the experiences of the insular inhabitants, their culture, their imagination, and their behavior, all of them induced by the insular space. So the islandness is the quality of the perception and behavior influenced by the specific shape of the insular space. A better understanding of islandness is one of the aims of Godfrey Baldacchino, editor of the Island Studies Journal. So, Island studies scholars or gnesology scholars come from a variety of academic backgrounds. They are anthropologists, ethnologists, writers, artists, geographers, historians, archaeologists, and ecologists, and so on. And there is at least one common thread between these people. They mostly work on representation of islands and insular life in the modern times. Archaeologists or historians work on earlier historical period, but they have worked mostly on very specific areas such as question of powers, for example, the Mediterranean islands in the antiquity, of distance, the Pacific islands from prehistoric times to nowadays, or also representation with islands in the literature. However, the paper is published in the Island Studies Journal and in Shima, which are both island studies journals, are too often ahistorical. It seems that islands always were and always will be, even though their perception and representation greatly changed through time, such as Karin Salome explains it in a work on Breton Islands. So one of the main problems for the historian is that comparing islanders, such as proposed by Godfrey Baldacchino, might be relevant for the 20th and 21st centuries, but it's not necessarily the case for the earlier periods. For the historians, the singularity of the islands is not necessarily brought by its shape, but by the discourses and the practices induced by its shape. These discourses and practices evolve through time. Most importantly, the discourses and practices were not the sole preserve of islands or islanders, but other environments knew the same. Alain Cabantou explained how sea and mountains appear as teratological reservoirs, inhabited with monsters and evil presences, sometimes until the 19th century. So forests, cold climes, deserts, wetlands, mountains, and islands face the same kind of discourses in European culture. These areas were comparable on numerous levels. Their commonality resided in several points, and one of them was the high death rate that these places knew before the middle of the 20th century. People would die at sea of great cold, of disease in the swamps, of dehydration under the sun, and they would be eaten by wild animals. And Swedish historian Jan Rudel explained how many small hamlets were like islands in the ocean of trees, and around the villages, in woodland pastures, the cattle roamed. So, furthermore, when we comparing island inhabitants not only with other islanders, but also with other people living on marginal or rural areas, enable to overcome the contradiction of the island laboratory concept. So I won't say a lot more about this issue here, but what we have to know is that today, the human social sciences scholar who study islands agree on the fact that it is becoming clearer that cultural isolation is a phenomenon that rarely occurred on islands, and thinking of them as laboratories can be misleading and inaccurate. So I quote here David Barraclough, an archaeologist. So today, human and social sciences scholars study the continuum formed by islanders and sea. And most importantly, they insist on the role of the edge of the island. Indeed, the foreshore is for several scholars the metaphor of the island, because it is a place of exchanges. It is through its edges that the island emerges, and Elizabeth McMahon argues that the binarism between land and water has been wrongly critiqued in island studies, most profoundly by Eberle-Hofer, description of the Pacific as a sea of island. In his writing, Eberle-Hofer claims that there is no hard edgeness in the world of the inhabitants of Oceania. In fact, scholars believe now that islanders are generally more aware of and in touch with the worldwide web of human intercourse than others may be. The foreshore becomes a site of possibility, and Vitte eventually concludes that connectedness describes the island's condition better than isolation. The Shetland Islands now were first, just like their counterparts in the Pacific Ocean, the playfield of sociologists, ethnologists, and anthropologists, Erving Goffman, Anthony Cohen, Alexander Fenton, and Rigmor Frimonsljön, to cite only a few. They were also seen by some as a laboratory where the evolutions of the society would be more explicit and visible than is necessarily the case for inland communities set amidst the artificial political boundaries of a continent. But for others, despite its apparently isolated location, development in Shetland in all of history have been influenced by repeated external context. The idea of the sea as a space of and means of communication between the Shetlanders and the rest of the world has been studied. The sea holds a particular place in Shetland historiography. There are numerous studies on the heterogeneity of context, mean of context, boats, fishing trade, travels, wrecks, and so on. The continuum formed by islanders, land and sea has been studied, but most of the time it was done unconsciously or in putting forward a part of the equation more than the other. It is, for example, the case in the work on scattles, on the role of women in Shetland, and on fish curing, for example. So the image that we have today of the Shetland Island was under construction from the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century. The 19th century was a great period for the construction of island image in Western Europe. It is in this context of post-agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, and romanticism that the landed elite, the travelers, and the observers, such as Sir Walter Scott, contributed to build the image of the Shetland archipelago such as we have it today. Knowing and understanding what image the islanders out of their own island is very difficult. There is, however, some meager traces that let us think that this image was much more complex than what was offered at the beginning of the 19th century in the discourses of the local or national elites. Just like the inhabitants of the islands of St in Brittany, the Shetlanders didn't call themselves islanders in the 18th century sources. Thus, when we rise above the 19th century vision of Shetland, we note the need for complicating the definitions of islands and archipelago for the local inhabitants, and for observing the relativity of insularity, insularism, and islandness through time and in the social arena. For example, going to the island was not the same at the beginning and at the end of the 18th century. The packet boat, a regular line between Leith and Lerwick, was set up in 1758, but achieved proper regularity only after 1835. Living in the archipelago was not the same thing for the different social and gender categories. Women, for example, didn't take part in the half fishing. They sailed mostly along the coast, and they were the one who stayed at home once their husband or son had died at sea. Similarly, the merchant birds could send their children receive an education on the mainland of Scotland. They could also travel more often, and they knew and had seen what was a forest or a big town. And this was not the case for most of the Shetland inhabitants. But these changes through time and these social disparities were not only specific to islands. They were found in numerous rural, coastal, and marginal communities in Europe in the early modern period, before the major changes of the 19th century, before the development of industrial fishing, the acceleration of transport on land and on sea, and before the development of local policies. So the particularity of the Shetland Islands, if we need to find one, lies maybe in the fact that in the 18th century, but actually it's also the case today, Shetland communities live in an inextricable tangle of archipelagos. The Shetland Islands are an archipelago. It's also the case of the United Kingdom, and it was the case of the British Empire. This multiplication of archipelagic scales is interesting because it gives us the opportunity to reconsider the notions of center-periphery and the balance of power between communities that are said to be far away and those which are close to the centers of power. But I won't deal with this issue today. What is of interest here is that both at the Shetland scale and at the imperial scale, we can observe rural, coastal, and island communities of different sizes and origin, on which discourses were created and corresponded most of the time to the will to dominate of the imperial power. It appears in the description of the Shetland Islands of the second half of the 18th century and of the beginning of the 19th century. In this description, Shetland communities are sometimes compared with native communities in America or Africa recently colonized. This inextricable tangle of archipelagos has to be considered every time one analyzes the experience of Shetland communities in the 18th century. So, yeah. What I'd like to see now is how Shetland communities lived in the archipelago in the 18th century. How did they live with their landscape and seascape, and can we estimate if it had any influence on their lives? So for practical reasons, I've decided to look at the influence the archipelago might have had on the Shetlanders' life with three different angles of approach. I've tried to see if 18th century Shetlanders developed insularity, insularism, and islandness. So in order to illustrate these processes, I've used a set of examples that provide us with possibility to look differently at the influence of the archipelago on the lives of the Shetlanders. And here I just want to have that it's a work in progress, so there's a lot of things that can be changed. So if we go back to the definition I gave earlier, can we find for 18th century Shetland a set of measurable realities accessible from figure or quantified data? Well, obviously we could use the standard geographical calculation that gives us the level of insularity, but this kind of calculation doesn't take into account the variation in human societies. It only considers the superior layer, so the shape of the island. Nevertheless, we can try to find traces and clues that can be quantified or measured, and they will help us to understand the level of relative insularity in which the island population and any other kind of population lived in the 18th century. So if we take, for example, the dates of arrival of information and the access to the outer world. So if we study the arrival of information sent from the centre, London or Edinburgh, towards its periphery, this might inform us on the level of isolation of these spaces, and if this isolation comes from its island situation or from anything else. So there is one archive material that can help us to achieve this goal. In the Kirk Session records, the ministers wrote down the date they fasted for the kingdom during the American Revolution. The first fast was that we find in the Rossness Kirk Session records in Shetland is dated September 15th, 1776, and the fast actually happened on Thursday 19th. It seemed that the knowledge of the fast arrived in Orkney 1 week before. Indeed, in both the Kirk Session records, the fast is intimated on the 8th of December 1776 and observed on Thursday the 12th, which day had been ordered by the king and government. But since the minister of Orkney ordered the fast in due time, perfect, and Orkney is another archipelago, we can't really say that this is the island that prevented the news to travel and arrive safely. Here, in my opinion, the main determining factor is the distance to the center. So now if we look, so what we can say is that it's extremely difficult to measure, qualify, and understand the way in which communities had access to the external world. What would be interesting to do is to compare a set of data between insular, coastal, rural, mountain, etc. communities for a given historical period and analyze their level of connectedness with the world. So then we need to ask ourselves if socio-political or geopolitical phenomena and peculiar institutions developed on the archipelago. And here we can focus on two examples, fishing terriers and sheep herding. From the 1720s, most of the landowners on Shetland had entered into fishing contracts with their tenants. So the tenants sold the whole proceeds of their summer fishing to the landowner as part of their rent. This system, which contributed to increase the place of fishing in the island, could be read as an insularism. But here again, I think it would be without any consideration for the historical context. Indeed, for me, the deckland system, although based greatly on Shetland geographic situation, was set up at a specific historical moment. Fisheries started to be legally encouraged, Dutch and German merchants were pushed aside for a moment, and most importantly, capitalist thoughts developed in parallel with the agricultural and industrious revolutions. The island wasn't the model for such a change, it was only a medium. So was there anything that could be directly linked to the shape of the island? Well, I think sheep herding might be considered as an insularism. Shetlanders didn't herd their sheep pastured outside all summer and winter long. It seems that this situation is almost unique for early modern European agro-pastoral communities. In the mountains, shepherds herd sheep and cows. In this case, the circumscription of the island territory, surrounded by the sea, the absence of predators, and the possibility for men to send their sheep to pasture on homes, are all reasons that might explain this peculiar practice. Shetlanders did the best possible use they could of their archipelagic geography. So, the last examples to consider the question of islandness will be spoken languages, experience of death at sea, and legend and tales, even though I don't have a lot of things to say about that. So there were variations in the way Shetlanders spoke in the 18th century. The accents varied from one island to another, but these linguistic variations also happened in places that were not islands or archipelago. But Shetlanders knew some Danish, Dutch, and German words. The level of their knowledge is not precisely known. But in coastal parishes or in border region, this could also happen. But I think that in Shetland, this was probably to a higher degree, since the contacts between the local inhabitants and foreigners could be done all around the archipelago. If we now consider the death experience, the experience of death at sea, the death rate for men fishing and sailing was pretty high in 18th century Shetland, even though here again it's difficult to calculate it precisely. The poor who have here in the Kirk session, poor roles were mostly women with children. But there is an online knowledge and a specific cultural institution developed in Shetland in the early modern period around this tragic question. There is, for example, no maritime ex voto like we can find in a lot of coastal parishes in the rest of Europe, of northwest Europe. So death at sea was part of the Shetland life, but it was never institutionalized. There was no persuasion, at my knowledge, no special investigation, or no peculiar cultural events. Eventually, it would be interesting to look at early modern tales and legend in a historical way. We could look at the tales and legend that were known by 18th century Shetlanders, also looking at the difference between the different social categories and gender, and see if some islandness emerges out of them. But it's an investigation that hasn't been carried out so far. So, to conclude, if I have a few minutes, I think that islandness might be a little bit anachronistic in the 18th century. For me, Shetlanders didn't identify themselves with the islands before the 19th century, when Romanticism, travelers, trades, and so on brought with them the idea of a specific island culture. In Shetland, the identifications process wasn't based on the insular context, but came from the community of resources represented by the Shetland community, the Scatald. The inhabitants of the Scatald were Scatald brethren, brothers of Scatald, before being islanders. So I'm not saying that there was not 1 ounce of insularism or islandness in 18th century Shetland, but that there wasn't one determining factor. They could be met on specific issue, but there was never one simple and all-encompassing explicative factor, and living on an island didn't shape entirely or differently the way people lived in the 18th century. It is in terms of degree that we can say that the life on the Shetland Islands was different compared with other coastal, mountain, or rural districts. Thank you very much.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions for Audrey. Any questions for Audrey? Oh.
Question about sources. I was wondering, I don't really go past 1688, but with Webster's census in 1755, does that tell you anything about deaths? And also the old statistical account, how useful is that?
Yes, exactly, but it's not very easy to have quantitative data for each year, for example. But we have at specific moments we have data of death at sea and so on. Yes.
Do you feel you're not really able to make more general conclusions based on that because of this?
Oh no, I think it would be possible, but as I say, it's a work in progress, and I will use that to make better conclusions, I hope.
Okay, thank you.
Simon?
Shetland is a county as well as an island group. How does it compare to other counties in terms of political identity?
I don't know. I have to look into that. It's a very good idea. I think I have to look into that. I can't give you an answer.
Right?
Audrey, thanks for the lecture. You made the interesting point that in the 18th century, Shetlanders didn't call themselves islanders. Nowadays, Shetlanders always call themselves islanders. What do you think the implications of that change are? I actually noticed on the Shetland News website today a Shetlander calling Orkney and Shetland colonies. So obviously there's an enormous psychic change, so to speak, going on. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, I don't really feel comfortable. It has. I imagine there is a lot of implication, and this change is very important in the life of the Shetlanders. But I don't really know. But colonies, I think it's a very interesting word.
You got any thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, but not. I can't go into it today.
Okay, not enough time. Right, no. Any other questions for Audrey? Right, well, just